Hello, comrades. We are trying out a bit of an innovation. We found it quite difficult, admittedly, to integrate audience participation into our usual shows, which are, take a lot of time to produce, etc. And we tend to be shattered after an hour and a half, and didn't think when we tried it a couple of times, it didn't really work very well to have audience participation in the end of the show. So we're trying this out and see if this works. If it does, then we want to try to do this every other week. I have a program with videos, discussions, etc., and then have a discussion with the audience about that show the week after. We want to basically be quite flexible because, especially in a period like this where politically things can change quite quickly, we don't want to say, oh, this is how we do it and that has to stay like that. So we want to be flexible as things change, as the summer of discontent might be on the way. We want to be able to integrate more current issues as well at short notice, etc. So I hope comrades bear with us and enjoy and participate in what we're trying to do. We see this show very much as part of remaking and rebuilding the left, not just in Britain but internationally. So the idea just to have shows that go one way is actually pretty counter to what we're trying to achieve. I.e., we need to, collective organization. So we're trying to shape and experiment and see how we can do that with the show. So be very grateful if comrades participate tonight, but also participate in the survey we sent out. It'd be really useful to know what you think is working in the Red Line TV show, what isn't working, etc. It's not something we do just out there. It's supposed to be a collective enterprise. So we would appreciate to hear your thoughts on future shows as well, interesting speakers you've come across, subjects you think we should cover, etc. We'd also appreciate your financial help. We've got 56 patrons so far, which is fantastic, each donating £5 or £10, £2, £3 a month to help us reach what we need to finance the Zoom account, our graphics department, graphic designer, etc., survey software. So we've got £270 coming in at the moment every month, which is great. We need about 500 really to become self-sufficient. So if you could help with that, that'd be fantastic. So tonight we want to look at the last show, which was Liberating the Holocaust Part 1. And there's been a bit of a flurry of discussions afterwards. One of the things we want to discuss now with Moshe Machova was the discussion we had with Moshe Zuckerman, a German-Israeli Jew, who was quite pessimistic in his outlook of the Palestinian struggle. And I thought I was quite surprised that he was quite so pessimistic. You in Germany have gone through exactly the same thing that the left in Britain went through with during the Corbyn years. And it's still going on. I mean, it's spreading in universities, schools, etc. Free speech is under huge attack, etc. Do you think it has something to do with the pro-Palestine movement becoming stronger? So the stronger that becomes, the stronger the argument against it, and the stronger the attacks and calling it anti-Semitic. Are they getting stronger in Germany, the pro-Palestine?
I would like to think so, but it's not true, because I think that the Palestine movement in Germany is becoming ever weaker from month to month, from year to year. I mean, I'm cooperating with them, I'm working with them and so on, but I see how poor they are, in the public sphere of Germany. It's not true that they become stronger. And by the way, it's not true that they become stronger on the world stage. In Israel, nobody talks anymore about occupation. But I think that what was very strong some 15, 20 years ago has become very, very weak in the last years. The Palestinians are not as strong as you think. They are only on the symbolic level. BDS is symbolic level. BDS has no effect, no real effect on Israel's economy or Israel's standing in the world. And this is part of the thing that we don't understand, that the way that we try to boycott Israel because of being an apartheid state It's not the same situation as with South Africa in the 70s and 80s. Because while there was a consensus in the world against South Africa, there is not a consensus in the world against Israel and against Zionism and against the occupation. Quite on the contrary, I think that whether it was Trump or it was Obama, or never would the US try even to think to abandon Israel. It is a stronghold of American expansionist and imperialist politics in our region. So
hello, Moshe Mahova. Thank you for joining us. Moshe, you're a very well-known Israeli Jewish socialist who's written on the struggle of the Palestinians for many decades, and Moshe Zuckerman is very well known in Germany, and he's an Israeli. He's actually based in Israel, so he's dealing in two countries where probably the political use of the Holocaust from the Zionists' point of view is the strongest. Nevertheless, I was very surprised to hear how pessimistic he was about the pro-Palestinian solidarity movement. Do you share his pessimism?
I would like to comment on this, but I would also like to make another comment about your previous show on something that I seem to have been missed out in your previous show, and that is about the famous film by Claude Lanzmann called Shoah. This had a very strong effect on the perception of the Holocaust, even to the extent of terminology. I will come to that point in a while, but I think not many people realize that this was a propaganda film commissioned by Israel. There is a very useful article in which the story is told. It is not about specifically about the film. It is a review of an autobiographic book about by Lanzmann himself. The author of the review is Adam Schatz. The review was published on the 5th of April 2012. He tells the story how the Israeli government commissioned Lanzmann, asked him to make a film from an Israeli Zionist point of view on the Holocaust. It took him about 10 years, so it was commissioned in around 1973, quite early after the turning point about which you discussed in the first show. Norman Filters, I made this point. The film actually came out, I think, in 1984 or something like this. What is significant is that the film is very tilted in, let us say, blaming, for example, the whole Polish nation for collaborating with the extermination of Jews, and hiding and underplaying instances where progressive and humanitarian people in the countries where the Holocaust took place were actually saving at the cost of their risking their own lives, were actually helping to protect and save Jews. What is significant is that the propagandist nature of this film is even signaled by its name, Shoah. Not many people realize. Let me make this point. It is a terminological matter. We refer to the Nakba of the Palestinians. The word Nakba is in the language spoken by the victims, right? It is an Arabic word meaning catastrophe, and it is in the language of the victims of this ethnic cleansing. The word Shoah is not in the language that was spoken by the majority of the victims of the Holocaust. It is a Hebrew word, and very few of them could speak Hebrew. Those who were religious would probably use it in their prayers, like, you know, Catholics use Latin without understanding the text. A very small minority knew some Hebrew in a more modern way. But the word Shoah, while it is recognizable and common in modern Hebrew, is not something that an average or even an educated Jew in Europe would have understood. So what is the point of calling the film about the Holocaust in a giving it a name in the language not that of the victim? What language is it? It's a Hebrew language, which is the language which is spoken on a daily basis in one country, Israel. So even the naming of the film was intended subliminally to connect the Holocaust with Israel as connecting a problem and its purported solution. I think you can see the point, but I urge you to read the review by Adam Schatz in the London Review of Book of 5th of April 2012 to realize what this is, you know, what the genesis of the film was, and also about the character of the maker of the film.
So you're saying that sort of happened just after the 6-day war?
Well, very shortly. I mean, the film was commissioned, as I say, in 1973 or something, which is shortly when Israel was mobilizing the memory of the Holocaust for propaganda purposes. This was always the case, but it became very sort of pronounced in that period. Of course, it took Lanzmann a long time to make the film.
Yeah. Do you agree with Norman Finkelstein's view that, you know, that was after the war, the 67 war, when Israel started to occupy Palestinian lands for the first time, and the international community was very uncomfortable with it and didn't want to sanction it, and that it then, you know, ratcheted up the rhetoric about the Jews having suffered like no other population, and that's why, you know, you shouldn't criticize us too much.
I think that is there is a lot of truth with it. Depends where you're looking at. I mean, I think Norman Finkelstein is, as far as I am aware, correct as far as the United States is concerned. Both the general public and the Jewish community in the United States. I mean, the whole question of the Holocaust and its political use became very important after the June War. In other countries, it depends. It depends where you're looking at. In Israel, it was always a question that is being discussed, but it's the political weaponization became more acute, obviously, after the June War.
Yeah.
This thing of, you know, depends where you look at is also brings me as a segue to the second point, reacting to Moshe Zuckerman's comments. It depends where you're looking at. He's certainly right about Germany. In Germany, there has been a very sharp turn in relation to looking at the Palestinian issue, etc. I'm somewhat older than him, and I remember going to Germany to speak about the conflict between Zionist colonization and the Palestinian people in the 70s, early 70s. There was a big surge, certainly on the left, of German West. I'm talking about Western Germany then. On the left of West German politics, there was a big section of explicit and very pronounced, and sometimes even over the top, taking sides in the on the question of Palestine. I don't think I need to mention specifics, but there was some cases where sections of the German left went over the top on this question and degenerated into actions that were wrong and unhelpful. But there was a climate that at least it was possible and even common on the left in West Germany to express opposition to the Israeli colonization, to Zionism, and solidarity with the Palestinians. And this has changed dramatically. As Zuckerman is aware, but to some extent, Germany is an extreme case, an exception, for reasons that I needn't go into, quite obvious, and that were discussed in your previous show. I don't need to repeat this. But to some extent, it depends on the degree of influence of American hegemony. I mean, the biggest force protecting Israel from criticism and opposition is the United States, whose special ally is Israel. So to the extent that the United States has influence in a given place, and especially cultural influence mediated through the press, through the other media, you have a change where it is more difficult to speak out. To some extent, it's deceptive. For example, in this country, my feeling is that while there is a lot of attempts to silence solidarity with the Palestinians and opposition to Israeli colonization and to Zionism, if you look at the grassroots, let us say, if you talk to, let us say, to young students, then it is not the case that they are have become, let's say, averse to criticizing Israel. In Germany, they have managed to intimidate the left. I mean, or the so-called left. I mean,
the Linke Party.
The Linke Party is afraid to make the slightest expression of criticism against.
Well, interestingly, that the Linke Party voted in Parliament against declaring BDS anti-Semitic. It was the only party that did so. All the other parties in the German Parliament voted in 2019.
Yes, well, that's something, but I mean, it doesn't go beyond this. I think Zuckerman was also right in saying that BDS is a symbolic act. I mean, subscribing to it is symbolic. I mean, it is true that it has not so far had any material impact or substantial material impact on the Israeli economy. nor I think is it likely to have such an impact in the near future. But I think it is has an enormous significance in terms of mobilizing and expressing grassroots public opinion. When student bodies, trade union branches and so on accept pass a resolution in favor of BDS, this has an enormous mobilizing effect and propaganda effect. Yeah. And I think it is not by chance that the Israeli Hasbara is so extreme in its attempt to silence it, to suppress it.
I think the image of Israel has suffered from the BDS movement for sure. I think it's not, the boycott is not affecting it economically, but the image, I think, of Israel.
Absolutely. But then also it depends where you look. I think it is more so in France, much less in Germany, quite important in the United States, less in Holland. It depends. So I think in this country, for example, the situation is not that dire. Having said this, I want to add that the role of the Palestinian issue as a mobilizing force generally on the left has receded because there are so many other things. True. If you look at the 1970s, there were two issues. I mean, there was still the South African apartheid, and there was the Palestinian issue, which were mobilizing the left, at least. Nowadays, when you have millions of refugees, including in the Middle East itself, not only the Palestinians, the problem of the Palestinian refugees, for example, has, as it were, lost its centrality because there are so many other things. Yes. It is not that people are less inclined to express an opinion about it, but it's not the only or one of the few issues in mobilizing the left as far as foreign policy is concerned.
Having said that, I mean, you pro-Palestine demonstrations here still get tens of thousands of people coming out, and young people that you don't get coming out for many other things. So it is still a very important movement. I could talk to you all night, Moshe, but we'll try to make this more about audience.
Yes, okay.
Thank you so much for joining us, and it's good to hear your view, and we hope we can do that again in future. Thank you for joining us. Good night. I was going to bring in Sabine briefly, because she's got a German perspective on this as well, and we've just touched on that with Moshe. So I think it's quite useful to carry on with that. Hello, Sabine.
Hello, Tina. Well, I'm sort of probably a generation or two older than you.
1.5.
1.5. Okay, fine. I went to school when German history ended in 1933 and then miraculously resurfaced in 1945. Well, we asked a lot of questions, and the reception we got was either sort of aggressive or denial or no answer, like diverting onto another subject. And we only found out by talking to people who had survived concentration camps or the war, and also by history books, which I got some from my cousin who lived in the GDR, as it was then. And that made extremely interesting and shocking reading kind of thing. But it was also helped that in 1968, there was sort of the German student movement.
And so can I ask you just, Sabina, you're saying the Holocaust and those horrors weren't really...
We didn't learn about that, and we didn't get an answer when we asked questions, so we had to try and figure out where we could get the information from, is what we did. So we sort of then worked closely with the students in a way. They supported us. they did a lot of the political education with us as pupils. I mean, we were about 15, 16, and quite honestly, we worked our way through the capital, which was pretty difficult. We also did a lot what's nowadays community organizing in a way with the unions, with other groups as well. We went into arts and everything just to sort of make people aware. And I was lucky enough to meet my political mentor, a very lovely gentleman called Leo Heinemann, was Jewish and a communist as well, who also was in the, worked in the French resistance during the war. He had survived concentration camp as well. Anyway, we had very interesting sort of discussions as well. Yeah, so I think we then also started a pupils movement, which was sort of mirroring what the big students did, the ones at uni. And we worked closely with the Sozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterjugend, SDAJ, for people who were in training or at work, kind of thing. We worked very closely with them.
Why do you think the Holocaust wasn't discussed then in Germany? Was it mainly, do you think, because
it was denial? It was denial, and I don't know what it sort of was, but it was a denial. It was not being dealt with. People just carried on. When you sort of think that we did training with, like in schools and with about school magazines, what people could do. And we sometimes had very strange places where we would have the training, like in barracks. And the people could tell us, we can tell you exactly what you've been doing the last fortnight, blah, 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 whom you have been talking with, whom you have been talking to on the phone, and all this kind of stuff, because the surveillance was big. Germany in the 60s was not a very democratic country. I mean, if you sort of think that the Communist Party was forbidden, people were still arrested and put into prison for political activity. And then we also had, in effect, sort of late 60s, the Notstandsgesetze, which is sort of similar to the act the Tories are putting through here. And that was all very scary. Yeah, so we had to basically keep organized and help each other out.
Funny thing is, when I went to school, Holocaust was all we learned about, because it was a bit later, and the political situation had totally changed, and you know, it was pro-Israel. That was all starting to come up. Thank you very much for joining us. We've got a few other comrades who want to speak now. Soon, Sabine. So we've got Norman pointed something out after the last show, and we're just gonna, could you just briefly sum up what it is you noticed, and then I'm going to show a little short clip as well.
Yeah, it was basically Graham Bash did a wonderful review of books about the Holocaust, a very interesting one, and he particularly looked at an account of Rudolf Werber escape from Auschwitz, and coincidentally, Jonathan Friedland, the famous Guardian journalist and Radio 4 personality, had a serialization of his book based on the same account, Rudolf Werber's Escape from Auschwitz, but his is called The Escape Artist. And there's a very interesting contrast between the way, in particular, that Friedland talks about the attempt to get the information out about Auschwitz to the Hungarian Jews. Now, both Graham and Friedland talk about the fact that the information was sat on by the Hungarian Jews, the leaders of the Jewish community. They had this information. They had the information about what Auschwitz was doing, but they didn't release it to the community, and which is exactly what Werber wanted them to do, because Werber wanted there to be a rebellion. He wanted there to be a revolt, and they didn't do it. Now, Friedland is very cagey about the reasons he gives for that. One reason he gives is that they just didn't believe it. They didn't believe Auschwitz was that this was happening in Auschwitz. Also, they didn't really want to upset the Nazis, and so they sat in it. But he also gives the real reason, or the reason that seems to be the most significant one, which was that a guy called Kastner, a Jewish Hungarian leader, had done a deal with Eichmann, where he was, which Graham treats in the program very in detail. He'd done a deal with Eichmann to allow a certain number of a relatively small 1,600 or more Jewish people to be illegally emigrate from Hungary to Palestine, Palestine of the time. Now, what Fried talks about that, but he doesn't say they're emigrating to Palestine. All he says is that he gets a trainload of them out to Switzerland. He significantly doesn't mention Palestine in his serialization, at least. I don't know what he says in his book, but in his serialization doesn't mention that at all. Also, the book doesn't mention what happened to Kastner afterwards, which Graham does, which is that Kastner was condemned in Israel as collaborating with the Nazis, with war criminals. Kastner has quite a checkered record, really. And he also doesn't mention that Kastner was a lifelong Zionist. He was a Labour Zionist. And obviously this was part of the project, which is now a huge controversy, which is that the Zionists were interested in building up Israel. They weren't interested necessarily in keeping lots of Jewish people alive in Europe. And that has been a big controversy. And obviously very relevant to the Ken Livingstone story, where Ken was forced out of the Labour Party because he referred to the 30s agreement, whereby the Nazis would allow a certain number of Jewish people to get out of Germany as long as the money was paid them. It's exactly the same with the Kastner case. Large numbers of money were paid in order to get Jewish people out of Israel and out of Germany into Israel. And again, this is uncomfortable, I think, for Friedland to talk about this, because Friedland was a notorious critic of Livingstone, applauded wildly when Livingstone was kicked out of the party, and has been absolutely leading the charge in The Guardian against the left of the Labour Party for being anti-Semitic. Friedland is a self-confessed liberal Zionist, which means he's not as bad, he says, as rabid nationalist Zionist, but he's played a completely destructive role in portraying the Labour Party that came to the fore under Corbyn, and saying that they were anti-Semitic because they were anti-Israel. That's essentially what it comes down to, and Friedland is totally guilty of that. But yes, I think it's a very interesting concept. Totally coincidental that Friedland has got his serialization at the same time as Graham did his program on Monday, and I think people should, if they want to look it up, it's a very interesting contrast. Thanks.
Well, it's not probably not entirely coincidental, because the issue of the Holocaust and so forth is investigated by the establishment. I mean, you mentioned that court case that was interesting in 1955. Kastner was actually the Israeli government started off defending him in a libel case, but ended up sort of supporting the libelous, the claim that Kastner was a collaborator. And the judge, I think he criticized the Kastner train because that meant he chose a few Hungarian Jews over tens of thousands that could have been rescued. And they called it.
He said Kastner was dealing with the devil, doing a deal with the devil. That's what the judge said. Yeah, it was later overturned by the Supreme Court. But the one thing that wasn't overturned was that Kastner had basically got a German war criminal off by vouching for him. And there's no argument really that this German war criminal was a German war criminal. He was a low-ranking SS officer, but he was absolutely involved in terrible war crimes. But Kastner said, "Oh no, he was a good guy because he helped me get a few Jews to escape from Hungary." And that's really, it isn't a damning indictment of the whole Zionist cause.
That's a very interesting point you've raised there, and thank you for bringing this up. We've got Agnes Corey, who wanted to submit a different alternative viewpoint on that issue. So hi Agnes, you've got a difference of opinion when it comes to Kastner. Can you hear me? Can you unmute yourself?
Am I unmuted or?
Yes, you're unmuted. But could you look into your camera, because we can only see the side of your face. Hi, comrade.
Can you see me now?
Yes, we can see you now. Thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you. So yes, I would like to make a couple of comments about Graham's contribution last week. By the way, thank you, Graham. I mean, you really prepared it very, very diligently. And now I also would like to respond to what Norman Thomas says. I am Hungarian Jewish Holocaust child survivor, so I think I have the right to say my bits here. About Kästner, it's not as clear-cut, black and white. I know people who knew him, and I know more than one person who knew him. It's very easy to judge in hindsight. We don't know for sure what his motivations were. What we know for sure that he did save 1,700 lives. Now, we don't know whether he was hoping to save even more. Now, rather than me going on about this, I very much recommend that you read Ladislav Loeb's statement about this. Ladislav Loeb was a German professor, a professor of German here at Sussex. He died only about 8 months ago. He was on the Kästner train with his father, and he has quite a bit to say about it. And I urge everybody to look at that statement before jumping to the full condemnation of Kästner, whom I didn't know, but I just feel that there are partners. And also I would like to say that he's supposed to have been a Zionist. Well, Zionism comes in all sorts of shapes, and in Hungary from 1938, there were some very strong laws against Jews, and then they were strengthened in 39. So life became basically impossible. So there were people dreaming of going to a country where they would be not discriminated against as Jews. So there were those kind of Zionists. In a way, I'm a Zionist because although some people say that I'm the wrong kind of Zionist, but in a way I am Zionist because all those people who really did go through the horrors, which they did through, they deserved at least the dream of having a country where they can live in peace. Of course, I disagree with a lot of things which is done now in Israel, but there is Zionism and there is Zionism. And I already wanted to say that because Graham mentioned that Elie Wiesel was a Zionist. Well, I'm not surprised. He went through those horrible times in Hungary for 3, 4, 5 years. And so it became part of the DNA to feel that the answer is Israel, Eretz Israel. I don't think that any of those people thought that the answer was to treat the Palestinians as they are being treated. So anyway, this is my point, what I wanted to say, that the Kästner case was not as black or white as it's being presented, and that there is Zionism, different kind of Zionism and Zionists. And am I allowed to put the Ladislav Loeb statement, the link to it, to the chat?
Of course you're allowed. Put it in the chat, comrade.
Okay, because this is a man whose life was saved by Kästner, and and he will tell you that some people did go to Israel, but some people didn't. Anyway, I'll just put that in.
Okay.
And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Agnes. Thank you for coming. I think Tony might have a different viewpoint or two on that issue. Tony Greenstein, he's asked to come on that issue. Also, perhaps on the question of the different levels of Zionism. Can you be a Zionist without sort of the displacement of Palestinians, etc., etc.?
No, from the very start, Zionism was very clear, and I mean from the very start. that in order to establish a Jewish state, you had to expel the Palestinians. I mean, Herzl said that we have to spirit them across the borders, and that was in his diaries at the very beginning of the 20th century. I don't accept that there is Zionism and Zionism. You only have to look at the coalition which has just formed in Israel, where the most ardent advocates were Meretz, the so-called, they were the Marxist Zionists when they had the name Mapam. And a Palestinian Israeli member refused to vote for the renewal of the emergency regulations in the West Bank. These regulations are apartheid regulations. They allow Israeli civil law to apply to the Jewish settlers, whereas military law applies to the Palestinians. And this Palestinian Israeli member of Meretz rebelled. And she's been subject to absolutely vitriolic attack. Her name is Zoabi. And that really shows you where left Zionism has gone. It's gone into the hands of the right. And the left Zionists themselves today are a fragment of the Zionist consensus. But I really wanted to mention, if you like, respond to Agnes amongst other points. Kastner escaped from Auschwitz with Alfred Wetzler on the 10th of April, 1944.
No, that was Werber, wasn't it? Not Kastner.
Sorry. Werber did. Yes, thank you. And he reached Zelina in Slovakia 2 weeks later, and he wrote down, they were even in separate rooms because they didn't quite believe them. So they were in separate rooms, and they wrote out what became the Werber-Wetzler report, or is often referred to as the Auschwitz Protocols. And the Judenrat, the Jewish council who had were looking after him, they realized that their hopes that maybe some of the Slovakian Jews, Slovakia was the first country to deport the Jews. They deported them to Auschwitz, Sobibor, and also Lublin, that there was no longer any hope of them coming back. And Kastner came to Bratislava because he regularly came every month. And he was given a copy, the first copy of the Auschwitz Protocols. And what did he do was he sat on it. And the reason he sat on it was because of his negotiations with Eichmann. Now, if you read this book, this is the Kastner report, which he wrote. If you can see it, I don't know whether you can or not.
Not really.
It's about 300 pages. And I've read every page. And Kastner's obsession throughout the book is the fact that his train of the prominence, as he called it, that was his name, not mine, that Eichmann was not living up to his agreement. And he says, despite the fact that 300,000 have already been deported, he still will not guarantee this train. And he was extremely angry, but not over the 300,000, but over the fact that it was originally 600, it eventually became 1,684, I think, because people literally jumped on the train at the last moment. But they jumped on it. It left eventually Budapest on the 1st of July. Now, I mean, Agnes says there's some doubt about Kastner. I don't accept that. I mean, even Paul Bogdanor, who was a vehement anti-communist and a vehement Zionist, he wrote a book intending to exonerate Kastner, but he found the evidence so overwhelming that in the end he accepted that Kastner was a Gestapo agent, and that is the reality. And although it's true that Kastner lied about exonerating one particular Nazi, Colonel Kurt Becher, at his trial, and actually he wasn't a major war criminal in comparison with some others. He was, if you like, a minor war criminal, and there is a certain dispute about that. What wasn't known at the time was Kastner had also testified in favour of far greater war criminals, including Hermann Krumi. Krumi was Eichmann's second in command in Hungary. He was responsible for the nuts and bolts of the deportation trains, arranging the timetables, arranging the incarceration of Jews in the ghettos. And he testified in favour of this man who literally had hundreds of thousands of people blood on them. He testified or wanted to testify in favor of Dieter Witzliseny, who was hanged in Czechoslovakia after the war. Kastner tried to intercede with him to get him back into American custody so he could be saved. And Witzliseny was the one who oversaw the deportations in 1942, from March 1942 in Slovakia. And there were a number of other war criminals, but Krumi, who had Lidis, the children of Lidis, amongst many, many others, on his charge sheet. This was inexplicable, other than to accept that Kastner himself basically formed an alliance with these people. The evidence really is overwhelming.
And why do you think he did, though? I mean, was it to save, the 1,700 people that some of whom he knew personally, or was it to get the train through and negotiate that, or is it something even more?
Well, he calls it in his book, and it was called in the Kastner trial. And can I just explain? The Israeli government sued on behalf of Kastner Malchiel Greenwald, who'd accused him of collaboration. It was a defamation trial. And Kastner was not the defendant. He was, if you like, the claimant, the plaintiff. But it turned into a trial of Kastner. And the facts that were found by Benjamin Halevi, I mean, Agnes shakes her head, but it is true. The facts that were found in the trial were upheld by the Supreme Court. It was really on a legal technicality that there were 4 main charges that Benjamin Halevi drew out of what Greenwald had said. And 3 of them were upheld, but the 4th was dismissed. And in Israeli law, unless you could uphold all 4 of them, then the plaintiff lost the case. So it's an absolute legal technicality. But the real reason is to have condemned Kastner would have been to condemn the whole Zionist movement. I don't want to say, because it's not just about Kastner. Kastner represented Hungarian Zionism, and he represented the Jewish Agency. And you can't simply lay the blame on one person. Incidentally, Kastner was assassinated in 1955 by, clear, it was Shin Bet, the Israeli Secret Service. But there's very interesting evidence that he survived the assassination and was in hospital. And Shin Bet then basically finished him off in the hospital. And this is really coming out. Someone called Nadav Kaplan, who's applied to the High Court to release files, and they won't do it. It's clear from the medical evidence he's obtained from the Hadassah hospital that Kastner was recovering, and there was a struggle, and he was found with a pillow over his head. I mean, the evidence, I think, is quite clear, but I think we have to put this, in a sense, all in perspective, that the Holocaust has become part of the imperialist narrative. Let me give you an example. I mean, I visited in Washington, and it was in the early 1990s, the US Holocaust Museum. And you remember the saying of Pastor Niemöller, first they came for the communists, then they came for the Jews, etc. And I looked up, because it's there at the entrance, this saying. There's nothing about communists, it's first they came for the socialists. It's been absorbed into the imperialist narrative, and Germany primarily amongst them. But what it admits, of course, is the American role in refusing to admit Jewish refugees. I mean, it was absolutely scandalous what happened, and Britain too. And incidentally, the person responsible in Britain was Herbert Morrison, the Labour Home Secretary, who set his face against admitting Jews. Why? Because he thought it would be an explosive element after the war if there were industrial struggles, etc. I came in.
Tony, we have to wind it up a little bit. Final point, please.
Yeah, I came in really with what Moshe was saying about Landsman. And maybe if I can find it, I'll quote, if you just give me 1 second, about him. Landsman admitted...
About the Shoah film, yeah?
Yes, in the Shoah film, which incidentally finishes with Israeli soldiers at the Warsaw Ghetto, which is a complete outrageous historical distortion. Landsman missed out the interview he did with Władysław Bartoszewski, who was a member of a clandestine network, the Zagota group, that rescued Polish Jews. Just remember, Poland was exceptional. It was the only country where if you sheltered a Jew, you were sentenced to death, and that was implemented. That didn't happen in other countries. I mean, people were executed, but it wasn't an automatic death penalty. Landsman admitted it excluded that interview because he said it was boring. In the end, he had to do a separate film called The Karski Report. That was after a Polish hero who had actually entered Belzec, one of the extermination camps. But I mean, Lansdowne was an out-and-out Zionist, and he fell out with Sartre over this. So, I mean, Moshe's absolutely correct. And I do recommend what the essay that he recommended by Adam Schatz if I can bring it up. It's entitled, for anyone, it's in the London Review of Books, and it's entitled Nothing He Hasn't Done, Nowhere He Hasn't Been, and it's a review of the Patagonian Hare, a memoir by Claude Landsman. But yeah, I mean, Landsman was an out-and-out Zionist, and Shoah, which is an 8-hour film, was incredibly hypocritical. It actually painted the Poles as worse than the Nazis. I mean, that is the irony of it. There was massive collaboration, without a doubt, the Blue Police, etc. But there were many, many Poles who did their best to actually save Jews. And incidentally, you know, it took 100 people to shelter someone, you know, because they had to be passed around. It took just one person to betray them. That was the problem living under Nazi occupation. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tony, for coming on. I think that was an interesting discussion about Kastner. It's important we have discussions like that and can hear different viewpoints. We've got a few other comrades who want to make some points. Gabriella, please. I think you've just switched her video off. Can you, Gabriella, if you could switch it back on? There you are.
Okay.
Hiya.
Hi. I just wanted to, sorry, it's my dog. I wanted to say that in I think it was 92, I did a 2-year course with the Holocaust Museum in New York, and it was for teachers of history to basically learn how to teach the Holocaust. Now, and there was a lot of detail, and it's quite an interesting museum. But the interesting thing for me is that one of the people who was on the course was a young, from my point of view at that point, he was probably 22, 23. I was a couple of decades older. A young German lad who was he was doing what do you call it, where you go to another country in order to teach for a year, and the United States sent an American to Germany. And he had decided to take the course as well. He was, I mean, there were times during the course of, I'd say it was a 2-year course in the evening. So there was a lot of detail and a lot of discussion. And we became quite good friends. There were times when I had to literally pour alcohol in him to stop him from going stark raving mad. I don't know where, I don't remember where he came from, or I mean in Germany, but he had never heard any of the details that we heard in these 2 years. And it just almost destroyed him. He was a very sensitive young guy. And I think he sort of saw me as a mother. So I was looking after him, but it was actually, I mean, I was surprised. I was surprised that he carried on with the course, but he did. He carried on to the end. But I don't know if he was unusual in never having heard a lot of this stuff, or if he chose to ignore it when it was taught, or if in his area of Germany it simply wasn't taught.
I think it has to do with which generation you're coming from. As Sabine said earlier, she, going to school straight after the war, when you're in that age group, the German government, the West German government, was run by many former Nazis. You know, we used to run Nazism, and, you know, you had to carry on the bureaucracy to some degree, and, you know, talking about the Holocaust was not going to be a good look for that government, which was very implicit. When I went to school in the early 1980s, it was pretty much all we learned about, because things had changed by then. Thanks, Gabriella. Ian has got a comment or a question. I don't know. You need to unmute yourself, please, comrade. Comrade, you still... you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Can you hear me now?
Well, good.
I'm coming from a different angle. Most people who support Palestinian rights up to now have wrapped it in the language of a two-state solution. When you look, for example, at what happened with the Americans moving their embassy to Jerusalem, despite clear UN decisions, when you look at the very clear language of UN decisions that does talk about occupation, even though Israel tries to talk about disputed territories, a term rejected, by example, by the Hague Court. You know, I wonder, when do we get to the stage where we have to accept that any future prospect of a two-state solution is non-viable and have to switch to unconditional support for the Palestinian right to self-determination?
Yep. Different discussion altogether. But
yeah, I know, but yep.
Yeah, I mean, there are some comrades, like I think Moshe Mahova actually has worked on a theory for the last few, a proposed solution which goes beyond one state or two state solution, because, you know, neither of them are very likely to be successful. And, you know, he's proposing a sort of a regional idea, a regional, you know, a solution, but that's probably a bit sort of too much for this program. But yes, thanks for bringing that up. Very, very important. Felicity, hi. If you could unmute yourself.
Yes, hi. I'd just like to make a comment, and I think this reflects Agnes's a little bit. I was brought up with the mantra, and literally it was every Jewish holiday, every event, with never again. So I think to understand why Jews, so many Jews, how they view Israel, and a lot, probably most, view Israel as maybe more important than the country from which they come, in the sense that they would defend Israel more than. So I grew up with that mantra, and as did a lot of Jews. I was brought up in I suppose you'd say, an upper middle class environment. My father was very well educated. He was a barrister. His whole family had died in the Holocaust. He had what they call a good war, because he was never caught. Well, he was caught twice, but he escaped. He worked for the French resistance. He was interned in Switzerland. He actually sat next to Hitler and Goebbels and Goering at a table in a restaurant in Berlin. And yet my mother, who was British, hated the Germans. She literally would say, she hates the Germans. She hated every German. And my father said, well, no, there's a difference between Germans and the Gestapo. And I thought, and I think that was very important to make that distinction. And also I'd like to say that the Jewish community with whom I grew up, they never spoke about. A lot of them were survivors of the concentration camps, and they never spoke about the concentration camps. I grew up, I remember I was very young, but Mrs. Turgle, she's Gina Turgle, maybe Tony's heard of her, because she became quite well known, but they would never speak about their experiences in the concentration camp. And people used to speak about, maybe she was you know, she was the mistress of a top Nazi and things like that. It was really bizarre. It was a really bizarre situation. It's as though they felt ashamed because somehow they were weak. They had allowed it to happen because they more or less were told they'd allowed it to happen. So, I mean, that was very sad. The other thing was, I was in the mid 70s in Germany, because I was sent by my father, who had business colleagues, like an exchange. I was a very young teenager, to learn the language. And the Germans I spoke to, because I was very, very inquisitive, and the Germans, the young people I spoke, had not heard at all about the Holocaust, really what happened. They knew vague things, but as I can't remember who said it, they really didn't know. They really had no notion of it. The other thing, oh yeah, Kastner, by the way, Tony died in 50, or shot in 57, not 55, just yeah, and so I just like to say that there is, I think you have to understand, I don't agree with it, but I think you have to understand where Jews are coming from. It's this fear that it could happen again. And so for them, Israel is a place of safety, is a place of security. I think unless you understand that, you will never get over the issue. You will never be able to convince them. I have family in Israel, and some of them are anti what the Israeli government did, but the older generation are very pro what the government's doing. They're protecting them. So, you know, I do, it's like history, somebody said in hindsight, you can tell, you know, like this guy Kastner, and think you can, and of course, history is great it's a great hindsight to know exactly what happened, but what happens in the context? I mean, my father tried to commit suicide twice, even though he had a great war, he had a good war, and he used to wake up screaming in the night because his actions that he'd committed as part of the Allies, and he'd committed horrendous. He made a German soldier dig his grave. I mean, it's horrible. It makes me shudder, but he made a German soldier dig his grave and then took him out into the forest. He was just an ordinary soldier. Took him out into the forest, made him dig his grave, shot him, and out because he'd heard that his mother and his sister had been shot in a forest in Poland. I mean, horrific things happen in conflict, and so there is a wider story. There is a very human element to a lot of what's happening. Just as I think that the Palestinians are being used, as somebody said, I think I saw in the last week, the Palestinians are being used as the excuse. I mean, Germans didn't suffer. They didn't really, well, yeah, they suffered initially after the Second World War, but they didn't suffer they were, you know, the Marshall Plan and what have you. But the Palestinians were the ones who suffered for the actions of people in Europe, Germans and others in Europe. And that's really, what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Felicity. Yep,
Thanks.
It's a subtle question, isn't it? It's not
Yes.
all black and white. I quite agree with that.
Yeah.
Malcolm, please. Sorry, you need to unmute yourself, correct? Should see a little. There you go.
Hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yes, I'm not Jewish, but what I would like to say is I looked into it as much as I can, and I've never seen a map of Palestine that shows any two-state solution that makes any geographical sense whatsoever. And that even goes from I think it was 1936, the first idea came out that the British government tried to partition Palestine into two areas. And I mean, there's no map. And if you look at the map now, it is a one-state solution, obviously, but a one-state solution dominated by Zionist occupiers. How it gets to a one-state secular solution with everybody being friendly, I've got absolutely no idea. But yeah, so many governments, it's even the Labour Party's policy that there should be a two-state solution. And every time somebody says that, I just say, show me the map. And you can't find a map. I don't think anybody can show me a map. Sorry, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Where do I go? What do I do?
Thank
How
you.
how do I disappear?
I'll mute you. Don't worry, you don't have to do anything. Relax, take it easy. There's a question, of course, with the one-state solution, of course, which is the sort of the way populations go, the Arabs would be in a majority. And
Yeah, well, I mean, you know,
that's not going to
I
happen
mean,
for the Zionists.
as your previous speaker said, I mean, the people who paid for the Holocaust in many ways, obviously the people who were killed paid an enormous price. I'm not saying that they didn't, but I mean, post-war, the people who paid were the Palestinians, who had nothing to do with it at all, really. I mean, they are the victims of it. And as your previous speaker said, the Germans obviously suffered all sorts of things, but they didn't suffer in the way. And the Palestinians were, I mean, the Balfour Declaration says that what it says is the Palestinians and the people living there should carry on as normal. I mean, that's what was agreed, if that's the right word.
Well, didn't happen, did it? Thank you, comrade, for
Yes.
joining us.
Thank you.
Hey, Graham, please.
Well, that has been an interesting discussion, but of course, the Germans did suffer. If you remember my contribution last week, I ended up by saying that the first victims of the Nazis were the Germans themselves, the German communists, socialists, trade unionists, etc., etc., etc. And we must remember this. And I think the lesson, when we say never again, something I entirely endorse, it's never again for the Jewish people, but for the whole of humanity, because there were so many victims of the Nazis. And as we will see next week, there are so many genocides. So it's really important that we don't just limit it, particularize it to the Jewish people. And I say that as someone, as a British Jew who was brought up in the shadow of it. Now, it was really good that Agnes came on, and thank you, Agnes, for saying what you said. I don't agree with you, by the way, and I entirely endorse every word that Tony Greenstein said, and that's something I won't often say in public anyway, but I do. And the point you made, Agnes, is it's easy to judge in hindsight. Well, it's often easier to judge in hindsight than to judge at the time. But of course, that's an argument against any historical study, any historical assessment. It may be a bit easier to judge in hindsight, but that is exactly what our role is, so that we can learn what the lessons are and try to apply them for the future to make sure that these things never happen again. So if there is a lesson, and it's something I said last week, and I think we're going to keep saying it, we're going to learn these lessons of history so that it never happens again for us all. And of course, I understand why Jews saw Israel or Palestine as a haven, especially when the criminal governments, as Tony said, in the States and in Britain and elsewhere, were refusing to let Jews in. I can understand it, but I can also understand what the cost of that was. And that is what has happened to the Palestinian people, and how it actually, worse than that, how it has Zionism has distorted so much of what was a valuable, precious Jewish socialist internationalist tradition. And a lot of that has actually been lost for all sorts of reasons, but part of that is because of what happened in the creation of the State of Israel. And I don't agree, as Tony said, there was Zionism and Zionism. It was built into the very creation. I don't actually accept that this all starts in 1967 with the occupied territories. It started with the creation of Israel itself, which was based, as Papaya said, with the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. But I'm really pleased we've had this discussion, because it's something that is so lacking, that we can have a discussion about the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, Zionism, without throwing names at each other. We can start with people, but we can disagree with people, but it's really important we don't shout and label people we don't agree with, and no one has to know it. And that's why I think it's been so valuable.
Absolutely. I was going to briefly talk to you about something you mentioned at the beginning, which I think is important, sort of why, Pastor Niemöller wrote his poem the way he did. First they came for the communists, the trade unionists, the socialists, etc. Because it's something that is often also overlooked in the, when you look at Nazis and the Jewish Holocaust, is how they got to power. And it was very much with the understanding and with the support of much of German capitalism, which had real trouble controlling the German working class, which was one of the strongest and most organized working classes, despite various defeats. And they made revolution in 1918 in various cities and regions, etc. were defeated, but still couldn't be fully defeated. And sort of that political understanding of where Nazism came from, it wasn't done against, it wasn't an accident, it wasn't done against the will of the freedom-loving democracy in Germany and beyond. It was very much part and parcel of German capitalism, do you think?
Very much so. But I mean, let's understand that actually at the moment that Hindenburg called in Hitler to become Chancellor, that was following quite a setback for the Nazis in the recent general election. And it was actually, Hindenburg, a Junker, a landowner, aristocrat, had a contempt for what Hitler represented, the rabble. He called him a corporal. And it's quite important to recognize that. And he called on Hitler because there was no alternative, he felt, for the ruling class, which was in desperate economic crisis at that time. And what we see is a ceding of political power of the German ruling class to the Nazis, the rabble, the mob, in order to maintain their economic power, because they and they alone could have crushed the German labor movement. The state itself was incapable of doing it, so they had to have a mass movement to be able to crush the German labor movement, just in a similar way to what happened with Mussolini crushing the Italian labor movement, also incredibly strong in the early 20s. So yes, it represented, it was an outcome of the crisis of German capital. It represented German capital, but in a way that it represented its economic interests, to protect its economic interests. It's a form of what Marxists call a form of Bonapartism, that you cede the political power in order to maintain the economic power.
Slight tangent there, but I think it's very important to remind ourselves occasionally why Nazism happened. Thank you, Graham. Leah would like to come in. Hello, comrade.
Hello, thank you. Yes, I agree with Graham. It's been a very interesting discussion and quite wide-ranging, and I'll try and be succinct. I think where I would agree with, I think, Agnes and possibly Felicity is the importance in our commitment to Palestinian rights, to be compassionate towards people who believe that a Jewish state is a response to anti-Semitism and the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust towards Jews in particular. And I don't agree with it, and I don't agree with Zionism. And when you study Zionism, you can see that I would say everything that's happened to Palestinians in the years since 1897 was written from the beginning. And I think it's important to remember that Zionism was a minority interest or a minority sort of ideology, commitment to that ideology within the Jewish communities in Europe, certainly in the UK, in Britain, until the Nazi Holocaust. That was the huge change. So I think that being compassionate to people who have that belief is really important. To just sort of, which I'm not saying anyone here is doing, to just dismiss it is not helpful. But it's also important to point out that actually what's happening now was actually written in the roots. So Zionism, it's in the roots of Zionism. It doesn't mean it's in the hearts of every Zionist, i.e. the people, everybody who believes in a Jewish state. And for me, that fear that others have referred to, that genuine fear, it could happen to us again. I was brought up without, a generation that came over in the big wave. My family came over between 1875 and 1903, so just before the 1905 Act. so I'm not aware of losing anyone directly. Nonetheless, I was very much aware of that shadow hanging and fear of Germans, fear of a rise of anti-Semitism, but also understanding that never again meant never again for anybody. And so looking at where the racism was going. But as I say, the fear that's there that it could happen again is real. And the wickedness, the absolute out and out wickedness of organizations like the so-called Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, picked up by the ruling class and the right wing of the Labour Party, to actually resurrect that fear, which is just under the surface, is an act of obviously political crudity, but actually also a political wickedness. Because while there were some of in the Jewish establishment who were milking it and manipulating it, that's not true of everybody who felt scared at the idea of a Corbyn government with those sort of lies. Yep. There's two more points I want to make. I'll be as brief as I can. One is there's a real issue for the working class and the left of this country to understand that fascism and anti-Semitism are not automatic bedfellows. It's common, but it's not. You can have anti-Semitism without fascism, and you can have fascism without anti-Semitism. And this sort of idea that if people aren't being anti-Semitic, however we define that, no, let's not go there, then that's not really fascism. So it's crazy. So at one level, the word fascism gets bandied about inappropriately, but it also doesn't get bandied about when it's creeping in, like this country, like America, just because there isn't the anti-Semitism that goes with it. And that's a real risk in the left as well as of the right. And my final point is, this will now be our second meeting, effectively, on the Shoah and its particular impact on Jewish people. And I understand that next week it's going to be other Holocausts. And I just want to say, and I know it's difficult, it's another example of the disproportionality, because every Holocaust, the African Holocaust through slavery, the specific things, for example, in the Congo, the murders and for starvation in Ireland come to that, let alone in India, etc., etc. And there'll be much more informed people speaking next week, I'm sure. Every one of those deserves the level of unpacking that we're doing today. And I really hope that over the next months, we can do some of that work together, because as Graham said, this idea that it's a special and particular thing rather than an example. Jews were not the only victims, although there's no question that in the Nazi Holocaust, Jews were I don't know if they were the main targets, because first they came for the communists and the trade unionists, but certainly numerically, and in terms of the rhetoric, you can't ignore the anti-Semitic elements, but it wasn't the whole being. And all those other Holocausts, which we're trying to address in one program, they deserve at least one program each, and this one's had two. So just my final.
We had a long discussion about this on our editorial board, as I'm sure you can imagine.
Well,
how we're doing it.
Put my 2 pence in for that, whatever.
And that's exactly the arguments we kind of had. But yes, we thought because of the use of the Jewish Holocaust as a political weapon over the last 7-8 years, and of course with the Corbyn rise and beyond that, would make it, give it enough reason to have its own program. But yes, we've had those issues as well, as you can imagine. Thank you, Leah. Okay, I'm going to take Jane Wilson as the last person, because this was supposed to be one hour meeting. We're already running late. It's a very interesting discussion, which is why I've kept on letting it run. But we're trying to finish by 9:30, if that's okay with comrades. I think you're unmuted, Jane.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
A brief aside, I'm a native New Yorker. I've been here 52 years, and I'm still in shock over what's going on over there. I know that's an aside. To the last speaker, yes, there are commonalities and quite a lot of differences with fascism and what's going on in Israel. And just very briefly, in 1949, if the Brits hadn't disregarded the Arab state, we might have been in a very different situation. So not to forget that in 1949, they did not fulfill what they want to in order to allow the Arabs to have a state. So I just wanted to throw that in. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Okay, thank you for joining us. Comrades, I'm going to bring this to an end now. I think it's been a good discussion. I think we should definitely do this again. I think that works really well to pick up some points that come out of our previous programs. So I hope comrades can let us know what they think about this. How did it work? Email us. Let us know what you think about this, laborbriefingtv@gmail.com. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a good evening. And we'll hope to see you next Monday. Bye-bye, comrades.